This past week has been a tough one. We were already living under the threat of the virus, experiencing feelings of helplessness as it goes on and on and on, even as things start opening up again, still wondering if we're going to catch it. Then we're confronted again with an injustice that leaves us feeling angry and even more helpless. We long to know what we can do to contribute to the changes that are needed in our nation. Well, Jesus calls us as his followers to be part of the solution. We're looking this morning in Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, and we begin reading in verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" Jesus replied. "How do you read it?" And the man answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But the man wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man, a Jewish man, was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any expense you may have." "Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" Jesus asked the expert in the law. And the expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Upon first reading this story, most Christians, I hope, would rebuke or feel harsh towards the 2 men, the priest and the Levite, who went by and did nothing to help the man, and would applaud the Samaritan for helping him. The answer to the question is not hard to discern. The man who was a neighbor to the wounded man was the Samaritan. Jesus' point is that our neighbor is anyone we see who is in need. Anyone we see who is in need. We should, as his followers, certainly help them. Not just people who live next door to me are my neighbors, not just people that live on my street are my neighbors, or the folks that live behind me are my neighbors, but anybody in my community, streets over, blocks over, are my neighbors. The people you work with are your neighbors. The people you go to school with are your neighbors. Anyone in your community is a neighbor. Even strangers who are visiting or passing through your community are neighbors. And in a larger sense, anyone in our county, in our state, our nation are neighbors of us. And if we see them in need, we should do something to help them. But there's more going on to this story than appears in the text. There are dynamics at work here that would escape us if we didn't know something about the culture that lies behind it. And so we want to read this story again and intersperse some added details that are needed by us to understand what Jesus is trying to get us to see. In our culture today, there are hot button topics being discussed, being debated. Things like abortion, immigration, what to do about the dreamers, and when to drop social distancing guidelines. These are all national issues, things that have no easy solutions, things that are constantly being discussed in the news, on blogs, in debates. Good people, bad people, everybody's talking about such things. In the days of Israel that Jesus lived, there were also hot button topics being discussed. Things that to them were of great importance. Things such as on what grounds could a man divorce his wife? What is the greatest commandment in the law of Moses? And questions about the Sabbath, what you could and could not do on the Sabbath day. And these may sound familiar to you because they came up in conversations between Jesus and his opponents. And there were different schools of thought in these debates. Sometimes as many as 7 different major opinions about a certain issue. And each of those opinions was named after or named in connection with the man who first proposed them. 2 men stand out in these debates in that time period because one was on the far end, one direction, and the other was on the far end of the other in this spectrum of opinions. Well, this question about the definition of a neighbor was another one of these issues that was being discussed at that time. It was stemmed from this question of this commandment of God in the Old Testament law of Moses that the Jews were commanded to love their neighbor as themselves. And so since they didn't like everybody to start with, they wanted to nail down who my neighbor is. Who are the people I have to take love, I need to show concern for, and which ones can I ignore? Which ones can I treat badly even? So the 2 men I mentioned earlier, the man on one end was named Shammai, and the man on the other end was named Hillel. And they had opinions about this question. And I'll get to those opinions in just a moment. I want you to note, though, that the first question, there were 2 questions asked of Jesus here. The first question was a question to test him. It says in verse 25, on one occasion, the expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Now, this wasn't a good test. This was an evil intent test. They were trying to decide where Jesus fit in this spectrum of opinions on these matters, on these debates. Because if they could figure out if they could get an answer from Jesus as to which of these opinions he went with, then they could figure out where he fit in. They would have him pegged, and they could plan how to control him or manipulate him or make him look bad within a community. The other thing to note is that's the first question. The other thing to note is about the second question. This question of who is my neighbor? The motivation for asking that question is that it says in verse 29, the man wanted to justify himself. In other words, he wanted to say, I have been faithful in this commandment of God. I have been loving my neighbor as myself. I have been showing concern for my neighbor, just as I do for myself. But in order to do that, it would depend on the definition of what a neighbor was. Defined one way, maybe he was faithful. Defined another way, maybe he wasn't faithful. And that's what it came down to. So we pick up again there in verse 30. In reply, Jesus said, a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, when he fell into the hands of robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. It's interesting to note, if you may not have caught this before, that it says a man went down from Jerusalem. You see this often in the Gospels. The Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. It was also the religious center of Israel, and as a mark of respect for Jerusalem, for the temple that was there, Whenever they were going to Jerusalem, they spoke of going up to Jerusalem. It didn't matter whether they were coming from north, south, east, or west. If they were going to Jerusalem, they went up to Jerusalem. And if they were leaving Jerusalem to go anywhere else, they went down from Jerusalem. They went down to Jericho. They went down to Nazareth from Jerusalem. Different way of speaking about direction. We speak because of the orientation of the maps that we use. North is up, we go up north, we go down south, because north is usually on the top of the maps that we use. But it also turns out that Jerusalem is uphill from Jericho. If you study the road of Jericho, it does predominantly go down. There are ups and downs, but there's a 3,000 feet drop, 3,000 foot drop between Jerusalem and Jericho, which is about 17 miles away. The path is very steep at times. It's not a gradual drop, it's very steep at times. Sometimes the path is only 3 foot wide, 3 to 5 feet wide, with a steep hill on one side and a steep drop off hundreds of feet on the other side. And of course, no guardrail, lots of curves. And so it was for outlaws, it was great. It was lots of places for outlaws to jump out and rob people. And so people were familiar with the context of the story that Jesus told. Picking up in verse 31, a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now Jesus is telling this story to Jews, and they were familiar with priests, they were familiar with Levites, and likely they're anticipating what's coming next, probably thinking a Pharisee is going to come by, because the Pharisees in Jesus's day were the good guys. They were the popular religious leaders. They were the ones that everyone looked to as the most moral, the most upstanding, the most law of Moses abiding, and so likely they're thinking that. But Jesus has a surprise in store for his listeners. We pick up there in verse 33. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. The Samaritans were scorned by the Jews because of the ancestry of the Samaritans. 400 years earlier, 4 centuries earlier, the Babylonians had swept into Judah, the southern part of what was the nation of Israel, and had taken over. And they took all the royalty, they took all the rich people, they took all the crafts people, all the movers and the shakers of the nation of Judah, and carted them off to Babylon and resettled them there. They left the poor farmers in the land. They had captured other people way over there on the other side of Babylon, and they took those people and brought them in and resettled them in the land of Judah and Israel. And those new people intermarried with the Jews who were left in the land, resulting in the Samaritan people. Well, after 70 years, a new king of Babylon, the Persian king, actually allowed the Jews to return home. Of course, not many of those who originally left were still alive, but the Jews who were there, their children were allowed to return home to rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. And they didn't get along with the Samaritans. Part of which was the fact that the Jews who were left in the land had intermarried with non-Jews. And the other fact was that when Jerusalem was destroyed, when the temple was destroyed, the Jews who were left in the land didn't know where to worship. And somehow they decided to establish a place of worship on Mount Gerizim. You may never have heard of Mount Gerizim. If you look on a map, I'm a map guy. If you look on a map and you start in Jerusalem and you go pretty much due north to Nazareth, about halfway in between, you'll find Mount Gerizim. And so that's where the Samaritans worshiped. And even after the Jews came back and rebuilt Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple, the Samaritans continued to worship in Gerizim. And so there was this hatred, not a better word for it. They hated each other. The Jews who had not intermarried came back, and the Samaritans, they hated each other, even as far as Jesus' day. And that is an important part of the story. And we see this attitude of hatred, of animosity, of prejudice in the answers to the question, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? The Jewish expert in the law rightly determined from Jesus' story that the man who was a neighbor to the wounded man was the Samaritan. Notice he didn't say the Samaritan. Jesus used the term a Samaritan, but the man, the expert in the law, he would not use the word Samaritan. Jesus said, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law said, the man who had mercy on him. Wouldn't it be easier just to say the Samaritan? He wouldn't say that. He didn't want to say that. Didn't want to use that term. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So back to the two opinion guys, the chief opinion guys, Shammai and Hillel. On this question of who is my neighbor? Who is a neighbor to the Jews? Who are those that the Jews are to love as they love themselves? Shammai said that only other Jews were included in the definition of neighbor. No non-Jew at all, nobody who wasn't a Jew, purebred Jew, so the Samaritans, only those who were purebred Jews were your neighbor. And everybody else you could, ignore them, you could mistreat them, whatever. Hillel, who's on the other end of this debate, he said, anyone is your neighbor, no matter what race, religion, or national origin. Anyone is your neighbor. Except for the Samaritans. Wow. So of all the opinions of Jewish teachers, of Jewish rabbis on who is my neighbor, no one included the Samaritans. No one included the Samaritans. So to all who heard Jesus' story of who is my neighbor, and the answer is Samaritan, that was scandalous. That was offensive. That was horrible. They were outraged. And even more so when Jesus said, go and do likewise. As Christians, we all want to be able to say to Jesus, I'd stop and help. If I saw someone like that on the road, I'd stop and help. But would you really? Would you really? If it was someone suffering from the virus, would you stop and help? If it was a transgender person, would you stop and help? If it was someone who looked homeless, would you stop and help? If it was someone of a different color, would you stop and help? And if your answer to the last one, a person of a different color than you are, if your answer to that question is yes, then right now you can stop and help. You can stop and help the American citizens, your neighbors who are experiencing injustice in our land. We have neighbors who are in need of help right now. They are often mistreated. They're often purposely taken advantage of as a group. For a Christian to treat anyone with favoritism, to show favoritism of one group of people over another group of people, over one person over another, is a sin. Reading from James chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. My brothers, as believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, don't show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in shabby clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Verse 8, if you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin. You sin. We must guard against any such sins against any other person or persons. But we need to do more than that. I think the events in our nation this week and even in the last few years shows us we need to do more than that. We need to make sure that the authorities are not exhibiting such sinful actions and towards those people of color in our nation. And as Americans, to treat any American citizen differently than how we expect to be treated is also wrong. Let me remind you of what the Declaration of Independence reads. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator, by God, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the U.S. Constitution begins with the following: we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union and to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Well, there are American citizens who are being treated unjustly in many areas, many ways, different places. And we must work to right those wrongs. But maybe this week, watching the news, you felt as helpless as I did. What do I do? How do I contribute to ending racism in my own nation? How do I contribute to bringing about change? I have no leverage. I have no leverage over Myrtle Beach, those of you who saw the story on Facebook. I have no leverage in the city of Minneapolis. I don't even have real leverage in the city of Baltimore, which is not too far away, in my own state. But I do have leverage in Anne Arundel County. Not much leverage, but I do have some leverage because I live here. And so I've started asking my black friends about their experiences here in Anne Arundel County. Are they being stopped and frisked? Are they being stopped in traffic as they're driving simply because they're black men, black women? How have they experienced racial injustice in other places that they have lived? I encourage you to do the same, to talk to black family members, black friends about their experiences, both here and elsewhere, but especially here, so that we can make sure that they're not being mistreated or treated unjustly by the authorities here in our county. We do have some leverage. We have a vote, we have a voice, we have money, and we can use that. We can use that to influence what happens here. If there are businesses that are treating blacks unfairly, we can boycott those businesses. We can write newspapers. We can write Congress people. We can state people. We can, we have a way of making a difference here where we live. And we who are Christians must do more than just sit by and hope that things will change for the better faster than they have been changing already. Wanting things to change, but doing nothing to change them does not end in justice. So I encourage you to become more involved in what's needed in our country. Learn the experiences of our black brothers and sisters as citizens. Learn of their experiences. Listen. Do more listening than talking. Learn what it's like for them. And then ask God to show you what you can do to change things for the better. Ultimately, justice for all will only occur when Jesus comes back to earth and takes up his throne. And the reason that's true is because we're all sinners. Everybody on the planet is a sinner. Good people are sinners as well as bad people. Police officers are sinners. Government authorities are sinners. Business people are sinners. All the pastors are sinners. We need Jesus to save us. And until he comes back, things will never be perfect in this place. Never be perfect on planet Earth. But that doesn't mean we should just say, well, it's not going to get better. It can get better. It won't be perfect, but it can be better if we'll work toward making it better. And as followers of Jesus Christ, I believe that's what we should do.